Napoleon III was, now it's very complicated, all of this, so just listen. He was the step-grandson and nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France. He was the grandson of Josephine, Empress of France. Her daughter was called Hortense de Beauharnais, and she was Napoleon III's mother. Her father was Alexandre Vicomte de Beauharnais, who was born in Martinique. He was a French aristocrat, and his family were very much the center of attention in Martinique. They ran it, and he married Marie-Joseph Rose Taché de la Pagerie, who in fact was Josephine. Now, they had a son as well as a daughter, whose name was Eugène de Beauharnais. And Eugène de Beauharnais, who was in the French army and he served under Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon I, introduced his mother, who was a widow, to Napoleon. She was a widow because Le Vicomte de Beauharnais, unfortunately, was guillotined because he didn't have the same politics as the revolutionaries, and so therefore she was a widow. He originally was going to marry a girl called Désirée Clary, who was the daughter of a very big shop owner in Marseille. You've heard of Clary, no relation to Julian, but Clarys also have a shop in Dublin. So they were Irish, and they had their big department store or whatever store in Marseille. So one of the brothers did actually marry Julie Clary. This was Joseph. Désirée Clary eventually married Bonaparte. Bernadotte. Bernadotte was one of Napoleon's marshals who became the king of Sweden. Because when the Swedes got rid of the Vasa family, which had become very disruptive, dissolute and corrupt, they replaced it by the Bernadotte. And in fact, the family that are the rulers of, not the rulers, the kings of, the king of Sweden is descended from Bernadotte and Désirée Clary. Now, Napoleon decided that because Josephine could not have any more children because of her age, that he needed an heir. So it was actually Josephine who prompted her daughter to marry Louis Bonaparte, who was the King of Holland, father of Napoleon III. They had two children, Napoleon Louis, that was Napoleon III's brother, and Charles Louis Napoleon. You may say, why have they all got the name Napoleon? It was to make sure that any heir would have the name Napoleon. Is that clear? Because it does get very complicated. So this is Napoleon, Prince Louis Napoleon as a young man. Hortense de Beauharnais did not get on very well with her husband at all. And although they had, it would seem almost that they only got together to produce a child, because he lived in Holland until the fall of the French Empire, and she lived in various places, including Rome. Now, Louis did actually live a long time, but in 1814, after Napoleon had resigned, the famous adieu at Fontainebleau, and he exiled himself to Elba, all of the Napoleonic clan split up and went to other places other than in France. They weren't in fact allowed to live in France anymore. And Hortense de Beauharnais, when Josephine by this time had died, Josephine also encouraged Napoleon to find a legitimate heir. So Napoleon III, I'm going to call him Napoleon III because it becomes too complicated, but he became Le Prince Louis. He was born in Paris in 1808, and incidentally, he is the first imperial person to be on the census list of people. Napoleon completely revolutionized births, marriages, and deaths, and so the first member of the imperial family to figure on the births, marriages, and deaths of France is none other than Le Prince Louis Napoleon, or Le Prince Charles Louis Napoleon, and he was actually born on the 10th of April 1808, and on the 5th of May he was baptized in none other place than Fontainebleau. So there's a big connection there. So as I've said, they didn't live together, that is Napoleon's father and his mother. Now, in the meantime, after Josephine said she couldn't have any children, and she encouraged her husband to divorce her. It was very, very sad, but he married the Princess Marie-Louise of the Habsburgs, and they produced a child, and that was the Duke de Reichstadt. That was the boy who became Napoleon II. And on that day, if he'd have been able to understand what was going on, Napoleon III would have been rather upset because he had lost all chances of becoming the emperor. He only met his uncle and step-grandfather once in Malmaison, where Napoleon lived with Josephine. So, after the fall of Napoleon, after the Battle of Waterloo, the young Duke de Reichstadt was kept virtually a prisoner in the Schönbrunn Palace because the powers of Europe did not want any more Napoleon pretenders. So he lived and died in the Schönbrunn. There is Napoleon, the Prince Napoleon as a young man. By this time, they were living in Arenenburg, which is on Lake Constance, but on the Swiss side. He was educated when he was very young in Augsburg in Bavaria. So he had a tutor as well in Arenenburg who taught him English and many other subjects. He was a very clever young man, and he spoke fluent German, fluent French, and he spoke English. It has been said that he spoke French with a German accent and English with a French accent. In 1831, they were living, that is his mother and his brother, that is Napoleon Louis, and they were both living in Rome. And there was a lot of trouble in the Papal States, and they joined that secret organization, the Cabinari. Well, unfortunately, there was an attempt to take over the Papal States, and they were exiled, but they unfortunately both caught measles. And their mother came rushing down to find them, and unfortunately she didn't get there in time, and Charles Louis Napoleon, in other words, Napoleon III, lost his brother to measles. She then sought refuge in Paris. This was in 1831. Remember that Louis Philippe, the July monarchy, Louis Philippe is the one that we really all know about, because most of Twickenham has names after Louis Philippe Orléans. He allowed them to seek refuge in Paris, but unfortunately, on the 10th of July, it was the anniversary of the death of Napoleon I. He had died in St. Helena in 1821. So there was a demonstration in the Place Vendôme, out in front of the column. As you know, there is a column in the Place Vendôme opposite the Ritz Hotel. It is in the shape of Trajan's column, and on the top of it originally was the King of France. That was replaced by Napoleon, and they hadn't actually taken Napoleon down, because remember, he was up there. So they went and had a demonstration, the Bonapartists. So then Louis Philippe said, I'm sorry, you've got to go. So they had to go where? To London. So they arrived in London on the 10th of May in a carriage which went on a ship, and in the carriage was Napoleon III, the Prince Louis. I'll call him Louis from now onwards until he becomes Napoleon III. Louis, his mother, her serving maid called Valérie Massuillet, and a servant called Charles Tellin. When they arrived in London, having travelled in their carriage from Dover to London, they stayed in a hotel in St. James's Street called Fenton's Hotel. I won't go into the whole of Fenton's Hotel, but if you look it up on Wikipedia, it will give you a great deal of information. Actually, if you want to find out where the hotel was in St. James's Street, it is next to Giustarini and Brooks, the only wine merchant in London with an Italian sounding name. Behind that, on the site of the Fenton's Hotel, is the Stafford Hotel, and there is a wonderful bar there where they have the ties of everybody who has been there. I am wearing the Palms Academy tie which I created, and there is one of those in that bar because my wife and I spent our honeymoon in the Stafford Hotel. So that is the significance. You have to have stayed in that hotel in order to leave your tie there. So unfortunately, Fenton's Hotel was on various floors. And so Charles Tellin, the valet, got fed up with going up and down the stairs, as did Louis and the ladies. So they decided then to go and move to a place, number 10 George Street, which is near Hanover Square. Please note that all the addresses were very, very posh. Let us say that they had plenty of money after the fall of France. We don't know quite how they got all the money out, but as we all know, foreign kings, including the Tsar of Russia, kept his money in the Bank of England. Well, there was a great connection between the Coutts family and the Barings and Louis Napoleon and his mother. So they stayed there for several months, and they had various members of their family living in London. There was Luciano, who was another of the uncles. He lived in Westbourne Grove. Maria Egypta, who was the daughter of another brother, lived in Petersham. She was married to an English lord, a Scots lord probably, because at that time all those houses in Petersham had Scottish nobility living in them. Maria Egypta was her name, and she was named after the famous Battle of the Nile. Well, after a while, they decided to go back to Arenenberg, where they were living, 1831. There is the Prince Louis in 1831. Here he is on his second visit, which is in 1832, after the death of the Duc de Reichstadt. Now, this is l'Aiglon. I think some of you may have heard of a very famous actress called Sarah Bernhardt. Well, Sarah Bernhardt, who actually often dressed up as a man, as you know, cross-dressing in the theatre has been going on a long time, and his various names were Roi de Rome. You may notice that although Napoleon's great idea was to stop nepotism, every one of his family he made the king of whatever place that he conquered. So he was the Roi de Rome, the Duc de Reichstadt. That was his Austrian title. And he was born in Paris on the 20th of March, 1811. And that's when I told you that poor old Louis Napoleon and Charles Louis Napoleon, the future Napoleon III, if they'd have realized, would have wept that their chance had gone. And he died in Schönbrunn on the 22nd of July, 1832. So the head of the family was Joseph Bonaparte, who, as I said, became the King of Spain. He lived actually in Park Crescent. Notice, of course, they had the best places to live. So he summoned the whole of the Napoleonic clan, and there were several of them. There was Jérôme, who was living in America. He had married an American lady, but unfortunately Napoleon I did not approve of his choice of Betsy Patterson, and so he had to marry the daughter of the King of Württemberg. So it was declared at that meeting that the Prince Louis, future Napoleon III, would be the heir to the throne if ever they came back. So they went back to Switzerland. In 1836, the young Prince Louis decided that he was going to mount a coup against Louis Philippe. Things hadn't been going all that well, so he decided with another person he knew called Le Général Paquin, a former Napoleonic general, to mount a coup in Strasbourg. So he went with his followers and marched in to Strasbourg, thinking they could just take over just by showing his face as a Napoleonic person, because there had been anti-Louis Philippe demonstrations again in Paris. Louis Philippe actually had attempted assassinations on his life many times. Anyway, it didn't work, so nobody went to their cause. So he was then arrested, and in fact, Louis Philippe paid for his fare to go to America. So he arrived in America. But while he was in America, he learnt in 1837 that his mother was seriously ill of stomach cancer. And so it was time he had to come back again. That was another visit to London, because he had to pass through London from America on his way to Arenenberg, and he went through Belgium, and he used the name Dr. Robinson. That was his pseudonym, alias, when he got back to Arenenberg. He was there just in time for her to die in his arms. While he was there, 1837, he was studying and busily working away on artillery plans, because he was an artillery officer. He was in the Swiss army. I must say that, as somebody once described him, a very great friend of mine who was the head of languages at Eton, Jean-Paul Dubois, former president of the AMOPA, our association, chaud lapin, which means a hot rabbit. He rather liked ladies. This is Louis Napoleon. And he had an affair with various ladies in Switzerland, one of whom was called Mademoiselle Zeppelin. Well, Louis Philippe didn't like the fact that he was there. He was a threat to him because, again, there was trouble in France, wanting to get rid of the monarchy, the Monarchie de Juillet, which is what brought in Louis Philippe when Charles X was pushed out, and he became le roi des Français. Louis Philippe was never le roi de France. Napoleon III was never l'empereur de France. He was l'empereur des Français. It was only Napoleon who called himself empereur de France. So again, it was necessary for him to leave Arenenberg, because the French had actually got a blockade of the city, and it was felt he had to, well, they didn't want him there because he was a threat. So in 1838, he came to London. As I said before, there was always plenty of money. And in those days, aristocrats often let out their London homes to other people when they went back to their country estates. This is 17 Carlton House Terrace, which is now the home of the Society of Watercolorists. And it's not easy to get in there. I'd have liked to have taken a party in there once, but it didn't happen. And that belonged to the Earl of Cardigan. Interesting, is it not? The Earl of Cardigan was one of the victors of Waterloo, and at this time there was no Crimean War, because of course the Earl of Cardigan was very much important in the Crimean War. Well, when the lease ran out, he went to stay in number 1 Carlton Gardens, which belonged to the Earl of Repton. Now, that building, you may or may not know, is the official home of the Home Secretary. I'm not sure whether they always stay there, because Mr. Cook, he didn't want to be there when he was Home Secretary, but that is the official London residence of the Foreign Secretary. One of the people who was with Louis was Persigny, who became the Duc de Persigny, one of his followers, and very much his secretary. And in his writings, he describes a typical day in the life of Napoleon III, future Napoleon III, Le Prince Louis, and I will read to you what it says. Right, at 6 o'clock, he would get up, shave, and then he would have his breakfast early. And after the morning, after the meal, he would read the newspapers and prepare his letters. And at 2 o'clock, after his lunch, he would go out for a ride in Rotten Row. This is him in Rotten Row. Rotten Row, as you know, is in Hyde Park. And you may notice his very smart clothes. His clothes were supplied by Henry Poole of Savile Row, who still exists. They are military tailors. And he was a member of 1 or 2 clubs. He was actually very, very popular. And he was invited to people's homes. He was the guest of honor frequently. He was a very good talker. He was very, very witty and very charming to ladies. And he was a member of the United Services Club. And in fact, they've asked me to give a talk there one day on all of this for their members and lead a party. So that could be another trip for us, a tour round the St. James's of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, because you always have to have a good address, and he certainly had very good addresses. So there he is on his horse. It has been said that he had very short legs, and apparently when he walked, his feet went outwards. He was apparently not a very good looking person. according to his critics. And he had a long body, so therefore his best position was on horseback. One of the places he frequented was Gore House, Kensington. Gore House, Kensington is situated on the site of the Royal Albert Hall. And during the Great Exhibition, a man called Soyer, who was a great chef, he had a cookery school there. The gardens were very extensive, and they ran down the length of what is now Exhibition Row, down to where we have the Natural History Museum. But that is a different subject, that's another lecture. So he frequented this place. And who would he find there? All the coterie of Lady Blessington. Lady Blessington was the original Bluestocking. And among her guests were Disraeli, Dickens, and so he was in good company with the set that frequented Gore House. It was Lady Blessington's place with her husband, Lord Blessington, Mr. Gardiner, and Mr. Gardiner had a daughter. Now, living in the house was the Comte d'Orsay. The Comte d'Orsay was the lover of Lady Blessington and Lord Blessington, and his marriage to the daughter was one of convenience. Now, in 1840, Napoleon III decided, or rather the Prince Louis decided to have another attempt at becoming the emperor because, again, things weren't going all that well for the Orléans family. So he seized the opportunity and with a group of mercenaries, they decided to make an attack on Boulogne. Why would they go to Boulogne? Well, of course, Napoleon I had decided at one time that he was going to launch an attack, an invasion on England. And at Boulogne is the famous Colonne de la Grande Armée, which is where they were going to rally and they were going to take over. There weren't that many of them. They went on a boat called the Edinburgh Castle. Everything seemed to go wrong. But let me just put in here that the night before he was leaving his London residence, he stayed in a hotel in Richmond called the Star and Garter. The Star and Garter was under the charge of the Ellis family. And of course, as we all know, Ellises are still in business. So he boarded this boat down at the Westminster. It was a steamship called the Edinburgh Castle, a paddle steamer. And then when they got further down, more people got on at Gravesend. And then there was a fight between some of the locals. And it was Paquin's idea that we would have an eagle at the mast. Well, the eagle was a poor old crow. When they got to Boulogne, unfortunately, they were arrested and they were all stuck in the citadel at the top of Boulogne. And from there, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was sent to the Chateau of Ham on the Somme. He was there from 1814 to 1846. He had a life sentence, but he was not condemned to death because normally such an act of treason would have meant a guillotining. Well, he was there for 6 years and he called it his university because he did an awful lot of studying. And while he was there, he wrote a thesis on pauperism. We mustn't forget that he was actually a very far-sighted, liberating person. And that's why he had so much support from the workers. He also had chemical experiments. And one of the things he decided on, and he drew the plans, was a canal to go across South America to link the Gulf of Mexico with the Pacific. And it wasn't the Panama Canal, he decided on the Nicaraguan Canal. And it wasn't a stupid idea, really, because there are more lakes in Nicaragua. So you wouldn't have had to canal so far. Anyway, in 1846, he escaped dressed as a worker. But in the meantime, he'd had a liaison with his laundress, whose name was Mademoiselle Vergeot, and as a result of that, he had two children, Alexandre and Eugène, called Bure. They were later adopted by him, and here he is, dressed as a worker and escaping from the chateau of Ham. And he then went in a carriage and got onto a train. Remember, this is 1846. There was already a railway line working, and he got on the train and fled to Brussels, and from thence he came to England and back to London. He stayed first of all in the Brunswick Hotel, which is in Jermyn Street. He then found himself a lovely residence, number 2 King Street, and that, when I took that picture, it wasn't there, but there is now a blue plaque on the wall saying that he lived there. When he was riding in Rotten Row earlier on, he met this very beautiful lady called Miss Howard, whose name was Anne Harriet. She was the daughter of the most exclusive bootmaker of Brighton, where she was born, and she later ended up in a place near a famous race course, and she was going out with the first man to win the Grand National. His name was Jem Mason. Well, Jem Mason was not a very nice person. He used to gamble her favors away to his friends. But fortunately, she met a very nice man who was very rich and with whom she had a child. So this very rich widow became the mistress of Le Prince Louis. And she was his financier. And she later became his maîtresse en tête, which means not head mistress, but his chief mistress. And she lived near the Élysée, and she looked with her own son. She looked after his 2 illegitimate children, Alexandre and Eugène Bure. As a reward for all her services, he made her La Princesse de Beauregard. And it might be of interest for people to know that she died in a beautiful house on one of the islands of Cannes. In 1848, there was the overthrow of Louis Philippe, and it was February 1848. So Le Prince Louis got in a train and rushed off to Paris. But when he got to Paris, he was told quite politely, "We're not ready for you yet." So he came back to King Street, and he wrote his manifesto for his return in the cellars of Berry Brothers and Rudd. I'm now going to ask Alan to read a little extract, which is from a very, very good book called Napoleon in England, Napoleon III in England. And I think you'll find this quite interesting and amusing. Alan.
In fact, he was soon conspiring again. One evening, he was taken to the White Bear in Bride Lane to attend one of the political debates of the Ancient Society of Codgers. And after listening to one of the speakers, a journalist named John Shearer, he approached him and proposed that they should have a talk in private. They left the tavern and walked into Fleet Street, where they took a conveyance to Prince Louis's rooms. There, describes Shearer, after a few jesting remarks on the lack of imagination in English writers, he opened a bottle of champagne, and before the bottle was empty, had me at a table hard at work drawing up a manifesto to the Irish people, calling on them to throw off the English yoke. Before entrusting me with the work he had in view, he explained, he wanted to test my literary suitability. and being by nature profoundly distrustful and cautious, he substituted Irish for French. The composition I drew up, if I remember all right, was distinctly champagne in character. It foamed and frothed, but it pleased Napoleon, for he gave me a sovereign for it. But as more manifestos were required, and the hour was growing late, I arranged to meet him on the following evening. Just before I took my leave, Napoleon altered the place of meeting. The landlady's daughter had come in once or twice during my stay, though of course I attached no importance to the girls coming and going, yet it so filled Napoleon with suspicion that he arranged that I should meet him at the Coffee Mill, a wine room kept by Mr. Berry at the bottom of St. James's Street. "We shall be quiet there," said Napoleon, and we parted. And quiet we were. Napoleon, who seemed quite at home at Berry's, met me at the entrance at the time appointed. And after weighing me in a pair of enormous scales in the shop and showing me an entry in a book recording his weight, told Berry to bring a couple of bottles of wine into the cellar. The cellars of the Coffee Mill must be of great extent, for we traversed several passages before Napoleon came to a halt. We were evidently in the middle of St. James's Street, for I could distinctly hear the sound of traffic overhead. As soon as Berry, who had preceded us with the wine, had fixed up a table with candles and writing materials, we were left to our own devices. Even then, Napoleon's caution did not desert him, and it was not till he had thoroughly searched the cellar, tapping the casks and peering into the empty ones, that we got to work. It was no light job with which I was confronted. Besides appeals to the French army and people, there were over a score of proclamations for distribution in the chief towns of France. The proclamations were devised to suit the tastes and feelings of the inhabitants of the different cities. During the whole time I was at work, Napoleon never once left my side. Suspecting all, trusting none. Even at this period in his career, he evidently thought that were he to turn his back, I should pocket one of the copies.
Thank you, Alan. Berry Brothers and Rudd, just out of interest for people, it is on the site of the original tennis court of St. James's. So it was a deep tennis court, and that is where their cellar is. It's still in the hands of the same family. It is now a Rudd daughter that runs it, Lizzie Rudd. Simon Berry has retired. They still are the finest and oldest wine merchant in England, and of course followed by Ellis's. I mean, these families go back a long way, so I'm sure they'll still be there even after Brexit has finally decided. He went back to France, and first of all, he was he stood for Parliament, he stood for the presidency, and he won in 1848. But in 1852, it was time for him to resign because, of course, it was only a 4-year period and they wouldn't let him extend it. So with a coup d'etat in 1852, he made himself the emperor. And there we see him in 1853 in all his finery. That is a picture by the famous painter Winterhalter. Winterhalter was the Gainsborough of France. And Winterhalter has been succeeded by many others. Laszlo, for example, was the court painter in the 1930s and 40s. So there we see him in his beautiful attire. Unfortunately, he didn't really look like that. He wasn't quite as dashing, but of course he had the wonderful moustaches. And I always remember my French master at Thames Valley Grammar School saying about Napoleon I, hand in tummy, and Napoleon III there. And he asked us all, who was Napoleon II? And I suppose that's when I started to research these things in 1966, a long time ago. Anyway, there he is with this lovely, beautiful girl called Eugénie de Montijo. I won't go into her life story because it's also as exciting and interesting. But let us say that she was actually, when she married Napoleon, La Comtesse de Thèbes, the Countess of Thèbes, because her father at the time that she married Napoleon was still the Count de Thèbes, and it wasn't until his brother had died that he became the Count de Montijo. They were married in 1853 with great ceremony at none other than the Notre Dame Cathedral. And Zola describes all this in Son Excellence Eugène Rougon. Very, as you all probably know, Zola wrote a great work, the history of a family under the Second Empire. Well, you may or may not know that I'm a member of the Zola Society, and I have all of Zola's works here. And it is he really did describe it. Zola never wrote during the French Empire because he was born in 1840, but he witnessed everything that went on. And as a journalist, he noted it down. So there she is, Eugénie de Montijo with her husband, Napoleon III. In 1855, they came on a state visit to England. This was during the Crimean War. And just before that visit to England, Albert had gone over to Boulogne, where he met Napoleon III. Well, the language they were speaking in was German. Now, I think he spoke German without any accent at all, which obviously pleased Albert, who thought he was a jolly good fellow. The only thing that displeased Albert about Louis, the king, l'Empereur Napoleon III, was the fact that he smoked incessantly his very strong Turkish cigarettes. And I'm afraid, and Albert was anti-cigarette smoking. Anyway, in 1855, a state visit was made to London. And it's interesting that the day before the state visit, Louis Philippe's widow, Amélie, who lived in Claremont in Esher, had been staying with the Queen. The arrival was quite difficult. They came over in two ships. One ship was carrying all the luggage and all the clothes, and that ship was driven by propellers, and it got stuck in the middle of the channel. So eventually they arrived at Dover, and they were late. And of course, again, Albert wasn't pleased because he paid out a lot of money for all these bands to wait to parade him in and play for him when he arrived. Anyway, they then took a train from Dover, and in those days it did not go to Waterloo or to Victoria. It went to the Bricklayers Arms, which was a station near where the old Covent Garden, where the new Covent Garden is, 9 Elms. And from thence they went in a carriage over to Paddington Station, where they boarded, and they went to Windsor that way round, the line that goes through the top line, which arrives in the centre of Windsor. Unfortunately, at that time, the station hadn't been built, so they had to travel from Slough in a coach to Windsor. Subsequently, the Windsor and Eton line was opened. In fact, it was opened, but they came the grand way round from Paddington towards Windsor. And she was without any clothes to wear. So fortunately, she was lent some clothes by Queen Victoria. He wasn't quite as large as she became. And the unfortunate thing of all was her hairdresser was stuck on that boat in the middle of the channel. Well, eventually it arrived, and it got there quite quickly because it came on the Windsor and Eton line, which was opened in 1848. They had a wonderful time. Queen Victoria, who'd been very, very suspicious of Napoleon III at the Prince Louis when he was not the emperor, she thought he was a rather dissolute character. Well, in fact, he was a dissolute character. As we've explained, he was un chaud lapin, and he had lots of mistresses and lady friends. Amongst them was the famous actress Eliza Felix, Rachel. So she thought he was rather risky. But once she met him, she thought he was absolutely charming. And as you see in the photograph, they're arriving in Windsor, and there is the Prince, l'Empereur Napoleon III. He is escorting Victoria in, and the tall chap behind is none other than Albert, taking in Eugenie. And there they are riding in the Great Park. They did a lot of things. They went to the opera, and they also went to, in 1855, it had been moved there, the Crystal Palace, which originally was in Hyde Park. But as you know, it only had a short time to be there. It was pulled down and resurrected in Crystal Palace. The area is called Crystal Palace. And as you know, it got burnt down in 1938. Great shame. After the Crimean War, they decided they'd have another big meeting to decide the fate of Europe and how they were going to treat Russia after they had defeated them. And there you see the new French yacht. Fantastically, it was the big yacht. It was called La Reine Hortense, and they're all arriving in the Solent. And there you see the barge coming from England to fetch them, flying the French flag in honor of the French visit, and they stayed at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Well, we won't go into the whole thing, but unfortunately in 1870, the French and the Germans had a war, and Napoleon III was actually the last emperor to ride into battle at the Battle of Sedan. His son was there, Le Prince Impérial, but the son, who was only 14 years old, was sent back to Paris, where he and his mother escaped to England. For a whole year, as a reprisal, Napoleon III was kept under house arrest until they had sorted out the treaty. And remember, there was also the Commune had taken place at this time. And Napoleon III had made France so rich that they were able to pay off the reprisals because they were the ones that had waged the war in a very short time, within a year. I won't go into all the achievements of Napoleon III because that is a lecture in itself. This is basically a lecture about him in England. Now, in 1865, when there were things going slightly wrong in France, they'd worried what were they going to do if they had to leave. Well, of course, they would only go to one place, England, because England is the place where all refugees come, because we are a very welcoming and very safe country. And they had paid it was discovered that a certain amount of money, several £100,000, had disappeared from the French exchequer, and they'd gone to a man called Nathaniel Strode, who was an estate agent in London. And he bought this beautiful place, Camden Place, Chislehurst. And that is now the home of the Chislehurst Golf Club. And one can visit it. The dining room actually is lined with wood from the Chateau de Berry, not Berry Brothers and Rudd, the Chateau de Berry. And there we see the Prince Impérial, the Empress and Napoleon III, sitting in the garden of Camden Place. Interestingly enough, there are lots of references to them staying there. The telephone number used to be NAP, N-A-P, and there is the Imperial Road, and there is a beautiful cross in honor of the French imperial family. And in fact, they found an awful lot of French money there because they paid their servants, and there were quite a few of them, in French coinage. They were louis d'or, which is solid gold pieces like our sovereigns. This is the last picture of Napoleon III, fast official portrait. He doesn't look all that well, but he became iller and iller. He suffered from problems, shall we say, with his waterworks. He'd been treated for bladder infections, and he had terrible stones. So it was decided he would have an operation, and the operation took place in January 1873. So if you look at that, that is the stone which came out of his body, and it's very, 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 very big. And there he is on the deathbed. And his last words were to Cornu, one of his followers who'd been with him forever, and he said, "Nous n'étions pas des lâches à Sedan." I pronounce it with a bit of an accent there, because when you have a circumflex over the A, it makes it a longer sound. Nous n'étions pas des lâches à Sedan. And there is his death certificate. It was quite a fantastic operation. They used, well, they didn't say cut him open. I won't go into how they got the stones out, but it wasn't a very nice experience. They used a special instrument. And when I actually saw one of those in Besançon, in a hospital, in a place, I thought, oh my goodness, that doesn't look very nice at all. After he died, thousands of workers came over, because I remember he was very much the man who was for the workers. It was Napoleon III who actually finally put an end to slavery in the Caribbean. They were still slaves on the plantations, the sugar plantations in Haiti, but he managed to stop slavery. He also allowed women to go to the Sorbonne, which was a new thing. The first women to take degrees at the Sorbonne was in his time. And remember, actually, they didn't allow women to get degrees in Oxford and Cambridge until quite late. And there we have the sarcophagus. Wonderful thing. It was in St. Mary's Church. It's a little church in Chislehurst. Originally, the Empress wanted to have a huge mausoleum erected out in Chislehurst, but the local residents said, no, it's too imposing. So she wasn't allowed to have him interred there, but there was a temporary chapel, chapelle mortuaire, on the side. And this is the original site of Napoleon's tomb, in Napoleon's sarcophagus, in St. Mary's Church in Chislehurst. The tomb in marble was supplied by none other than the Empress's great friend, Queen Victoria. And she then, on her way, it took several years between the death in 1893 and eventually coming to Farnborough. She, for several months, while she was getting ready to move into Farnborough Hill House, which was the home of the Nelson family, Thomas Nelson and Sons, she had bought for an extraordinary amount of money. And again, that was all changed. It is now Farnborough Hills School, very good school in Farnborough. And I have taken quite a few parties of people there. And there is the mausoleum, the final resting place. The chapel was built by the same architect who was a restorer of the Notre Dame, Détailleur. And the organ is a Cavalier, I can't remember exactly, Cavalier Cavillon. It's a wonderful organ, one of the greatest organs, and they have concerts there, to which I have been. When my step cousin, I suppose you could say, was Le Père Supérieur, and that is the monastery. It was originally for Cistercian monks who were there to pray 5 masses a day over Napoleon III. And there you see his wonderful tomb. And that is the end of the lecture. I think I need a drink of water now.